Rob Van Eijk, the Future of Privacy Forum's Managing Director for Europe, joins the Plutopia podcast this time. Contributing Editor Wendy Grossman joins John and Scoop in this wide-ranging discussion about data privacy and advertising technology. We explore digital advertising, cookies, ad blockers, privacy law, AI and ads, and we ask the question, what the heck is hyper-nudging?
The fact that you interact with digital content makes it that your behavior will be recorded, but also in real time analyzed. And obviously, we're all individuals. We have many aspects in common, of course, but there are aspects that generative AI will be able to pick up. And then ads and value propositions can be changed according to that. So this is what I mean with hyper nudging. The statistical approach of A/B testing works really well with being able to fine-tune that communication that you have through digital advertisements and your web browsing behavior, to fine-tune that to who we are.
Hey everybody, welcome to the latest Plutopia podcast. I'm John Lepkowski of Plutopia News Network. I'm here with my partner Scoop Sweeney and our other co-host and contributing editor Wendy Grossman. And our guest today is Dr. Rob Van Eijk. Rob is Managing Director for Europe for the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a DC-based think tank and advocacy group that focuses on issues of data privacy. And he focuses particularly on the impact of data flows and machine learning on human rights. He's an established and well-respected leader in the data protection field. So Rob, we're happy to have you here. And Wendy, I'm going to hand this over to you so that we can start our discussion.
Well, Rob and I, as far as I know, first encountered each other sometime around 2010 or 2012 when I was researching a paper on the future of automation. And then we reconnected this year at the Computers, Privacy and Data Protection Conference back in May in Brussels. And I had not quite, I hadn't quite registered that Rob was the author of significant work on an ad tech technique called real-time bidding, and I was going to ask him to talk a bit about the state of affairs in ad tech, because one of the interesting things about it is, as I understand it, Rob's work basically proved that the entire the digital personalized advertising industry is actually illegal under the European Union's general data protection regulation, which is kind of an interesting situation. So, Rob, do you want to explain a bit about that?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Hello, Wendy, John, Scoop. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, Wendy and I reconnected this year during a CPDP conference, and indeed, I focus on digital advertising, and more specifically on where the whole landscape is changing. I mean, there's some big announcements out there, and Google is rolling out its post-cookie technology landscape. So looking at basically the privacy implications is going to be important. And on the other hand, we have metaverse and immersive technologies on the horizon. And obviously the real question there will be, how will the advertising business model be replicated in these new technologies? So these are like very interesting changes in terms of where we actually started looking at this like a decade ago. Obviously, that the whole landscape has changed quite a bit, but that doesn't mean it has become less interesting. I think there's a lot happening, and we can zoom in a little bit more during this talk today. So thank you.
Okay, so I mean, I think most people don't really understand how stuff like real-time bidding works. Do you want to give people a little insight into the inner workings of this industry, that they see the product every day but don't understand?
Yeah, so a lot of the data behind the advertisement that's being shown to a user, whether that's on the mobile phone in an app, or whether that's traditionally on like the web, on your laptop, on your iPad. It's like a whole complex web of companies that work together and specialize in different aspects of making that advertisement possible. Traditionally, ads were shown part of the newspaper or the website that you were visiting. But nowadays, most of the advertisements out there today are being sold and bought, similar to how stocks are traded. So this is where the bidding element and real-time bidding comes from. And real-time means this is really in the blink of an eye. And Julia Engwind had a really nice piece in the New York Times in 2010, where we really zoomed in on one of the bigger players at the time. Obviously, we have Google, we have Facebook/Meta, but at that time we had Rubicon as a major player within the real-time bidding ecosystem. This all circles around the cookie, and the cookie is actually important. The cookie is like basically a little bit of text that's stored on your device. It contains a unique identifier. And the uniqueness of this identifier is important because it allows all actors within the advertising landscape to add or connect or link data based on that unique identifier. And this what is also known as like profiles, building profiles. You can add online data about your website visiting behavior to it, but you can also add data points to it on how you consume news. Are there like specific topics that you're interested in? So in order to record your online behavior, you need detailed data points, and you need a unique identifier in order to connect all these together. So 1,000-foot overview here. We're talking about a digital ad that's shown to a user. We're talking about a unique cookie that's being shared amongst many different actors that specialize in different aspects of that advertisement, for the purpose of showing an ad to a very specific audience that a brand may be interested in connecting, maybe doing a value proposition for new pair of shoes, or for a short holiday for the weekend, for example, but also remembering and being able to recognize that user through time from that moment onwards, typically how an advertising campaign will be defined. And obviously, when a brand starts offering money to show ads to the audience that they're interested in, you also want to know whether that dollar or that euro was spent well. So measuring the quality of an advertisement campaign is important as well. So reporting becomes an aspect there as well. I know this is like a very complex picture, but the point that I want to make and to take home is that it's a very well developed technology. It's not done in isolation anymore. It relies on a network of sometimes more than 1,000 or 2,000 different companies acting together and trading, buying and selling these spaces on websites and within apps in order to show ads to the audience that brands may be interested in.
It's really amazing to me, you know, when you think about you're just looking at a web page, and the notion that behind the scenes this enormous machinery is springing into action, you know, to try to sell me something, and I'm really not. I'm not a good target at all. Especially, does this, if you have an ad blocker set up, does this all go on anyway? Is it all just kind of thrown away?
This is about defaults. It obviously depends on which market you're in. So if you're browsing the web from the US, will be quite different than when you browse it from Europe. Ad blockers and defaults in browsers shipped to these different markets do matter, of course. Currently, most of the technology still relies on the third-party cookie, and the browser differentiates between like content that's being loaded from the website that you're visiting, like www.newyorktimes.com, and third-party content like the programming code you need to make the ad appealing, to make it dynamic. This is all additional code that needs to be downloaded from somewhere else, from third parties. And browsers are designed to block bad actors in this space. So yes, it helps to use ad blockers to a certain extent, but obviously there's a cat and mouse game that's been developing over the last 15 years, where obviously browser mechanisms can be circumvented by additional programming code, and also sometimes even with very persistent types of technologies that cannot be blocked or circumvented because of the nature how the internet is designed. If you visit a website, it's not just about the website that you typed in basically in the browser. It's also about communicating between your computer and the servers that basically serve you the content. And the IP address, which is another unique identifier, comes with a lot of additional information when all these pieces of information are shipped over the internet. And these, obviously, they have a functional use, but they can be reused or maybe abused for other means. For instance, to be able to recognize a user that may have visited a website before. And maybe we'll touch on this later, but we call this fingerprinting, which is another type of technology separate to the cookie.
Rob, I've been experienced recently, very recently, the effects of this kind of advertising. I was researching something on cremation practices in various cultures, so I was Googling through it. And almost immediately, I began getting ads from Amazon and all these different sales operations offering me crematory services, cremation insurance, all sorts of things. It was almost immediate. And
they also offer you somebody to kill you so that you would be able to take advantage of these services?
oh, well, given what the state of the stuff I was receiving, I would welcome death as opposed to enduring these kind of ads. Another source that I've found of this ad tech is on LinkedIn. I'm on there and I'm listed as an officer of Plutopia. And they have begun sending me all this stuff, especially from tech companies offering their services. And it's obviously automated because if you read these things, you'll spot that they're identical, even though the company is different. They'll just change names, and they even put my name in saying, I'm following up on a email sent from our employee Scoop that it's like, no, you didn't. So I'm seeing that a lot. And there's not really anything I can do about that. I've complained to LinkedIn and they don't care. But in Europe, it seems like there's a lot more that's being done to stop this sort of thing. The legislation in Europe is way better than we have here. Why is that?
Well, it boils down to cultural differences. I mean, there's obviously no federal privacy law in the US yet. So the main instrument that's being used is a consumer law, which rests on the principles of unfair and deceptive. Obviously, we have consumer law as well in Europe. But in that space, the regulators have not been very active, although there were some recent developments where consumer authorities are starting to use privacy arguments in court cases, but that's like a very different topic to zoom in on. So yeah, after the Second World War and through the 80s with the OECD guidelines, we saw the sunrise of the predecessor of the current privacy law, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was the Privacy Directive. It took almost 15 years for this framework to be negotiated and adopted. And obviously the GDPR at some point came into force. But in parallel to that, there is another important piece of legislation in force, which is the e-privacy directive. And this is about protecting a different sphere. So the privacy law is rooted in the Charter of Fundamental Rights in Europe. And that's to protect the family, to protect like your home, which is a very different type of fundamental right than like your Internet of Things device or your smartphone or your computer, or even the browser, which has the ability to store information. So that sphere within your browser, within your computer, has separate protection under cookie rules. And both are in most countries enforced by data protection authorities, and they have been appointed specifically by the privacy regulation. So this, similar to the FTC, which has been appointed in the US to enforce, we have the privacy regulators in the EU, but obviously they have different legal instruments to work with, and they're there to protect not the rights based on unfairness, but based on protecting the human rights, like which are enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So there's cultural differences there, and obviously under the cookie laws, consent has been the threshold. Basically to be able to put something in that protected sphere or to take something out that has previously been stored in there. So this is why cookies are governed by consent. And this is why on websites, if you visit websites like through a VPN in Europe, or if you're on a holiday and you visit websites from your hotel here in Europe, you'll see consent banners before you can actually start browsing a website. Obviously, because there's a connection between the cookie law and the privacy law, any data flow connected to the cookie, to these unique identifiers, which store information about your online behavior, are presumed to be a processing of personal data. And this is how the two are then connected, because accountability under the GDPR is relatively complex. One of the things that stand out is that your processing needs to be lawful. And obviously there are different flavors there. You can, like a contract, a legitimate interest, but consent obviously is an important one. And recently, basically over the years, there's been a lot of pushback from civil society. There's been a lot of complaints, and through the court system, also the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, it's now clear that cookies are enforced, data protection processes are enforced, and consent is the norm, because one of the things that stand out is that if it's not strictly necessary to provide your service, to provide your online newspaper, it's an additional service. And consent is the rule, because at the moment it's still based on cookies. So this is why you see this complexity. You see many consent banners. You have to make a choice in Europe. But also there's a big legislative battle on, for instance, on platforms from Meta. The Norwegian DPA pushed back and said, well, Meta, your behavioral advertising, the default should be that it's not based on behavioral data flows, and you need to ask people for consent first. If you visit youtube.com here in Europe, you'll get the choice to say, okay, I want to accept advertising cookies, or I want to reject them. And it's a choice that's not influenced by banner sizes or by colors or by other types of nudging you can apply to these banners. But that's the result of how DPAs are enforcing this. And in this case, the French Data Protection Authority has been specifically very active in this space. So two examples, like the Meta example and the YouTube example, the CNIL, speak to these observations, Scoop.
I don't have a reference for this, but I had heard of one or more studies that found that serving ads based on the content, the context of the ad, the content on the page where the ad appears, had been found to be as effective as serving an ad based on personalization. And I've wondered, especially with an increased attention to policies that indicate a concern with the degree of personalization, whether there's a move away from using personalization to serve ads, and whether there's a move toward serving ads based on context instead.
No, I see that as well. I mean, there are only a few examples out there that experiment at scale with contextual advertising. New York Times is one of them, but in the Netherlands, we have a network called Ster. They monetize advertising space for public broadcasting organizations. In Norway, there's a network called Kobler, does similar. The problem is that contextual advertising is not available for every publisher. You need a lot of content, and whether it's video content or whether it's textual content, the machine learning needs to define the context and derive the context from data that's available and data that's being consumed. So typically, and let me focus on the example in the Netherlands, the content is transformed into context through machine learning, and then the advertising space is sold, obviously still based on real-time bidding and a unique identifier. But the trick is to use the same unique identifier for all your website visitors. So you will still be able to measure a frequency and reach and other metrics about the quality of your advertising campaign, but you will not know that you're serving the ad to Wendy or to Rob or to John. And in terms of like product placement, I mean, you could, the machine learning now, the machine learning is so refined now that you could actually do a real-time advertising for certain products that are shown in a documentary or in another video or in a sitcom, for example, that people are viewing. So just to give an idea that the privacy enhancement here is to not retain any data or knowledge in profiles about individual users, but to transpose the additional information that's based on which an ad is sold. It's based on the content that's actually being consumed in real time. That's different advertising model that we've seen develop over the years, where everything was connected to trying to build up a good view on the mental state of an individual user. For instance, metrics about buying intent. If you've shown interest for a new electric toothbrush, you'll see ads following you around on different websites, like for the next 6 weeks, trying to make you click on that ad and maybe actually choose one of these electric toothbrushes and close the sale, you know. So this is based on your expression of possibly being on the market for a new purchase. And that's an individual web browsing behavior data point kept in a profile. So these are like two different types of advertising models out there, unfortunately, and it's sometimes very difficult to find new heroes. But I think the contextual model should be explored more and more. And it's a good model for some, and not for everybody, as I try to explain. But it works really well. And in terms of economic differences, the numbers that I've seen, and they're also public for the Dutch model, are way better than in comparison to the behavioral model that they used before. So for some, it can actually be a very profitable choice as well to embrace the privacy improvements and not choosing for a model that's based on building web profiles. Yes.
The thing is, you know, the thing I always hear people complain about is they just bought something, you know, something that you wouldn't buy very often, like, I don't know, an outdoor barbecue or a house, I don't know, something. And then for weeks afterwards, they'll see ads for that thing. Which always reminded me of the late journalist John Diamond, who always said, he had a column in the Sunday Times, and he could write about anything he wanted. So, every so often he'd write about something like toilet paper. And for the next 10 years, he'd be getting press releases from PR people who were absolutely convinced that here was a journalist who covered toilet paper. And they're really hard to find, So it seems to be a lot like that. So there is a whole thing going on that Google is getting rid of the cookie, right? Isn't that their current gambit? And from what I understand, it's not actually going to be any better for privacy, but I'm not sure people understand the change that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, Google is testing new ways of maybe it's better to characterize them as small privacy improvements in comparison to where we are today. So today we're in a landscape where there's not a lot of control on who's collecting or sharing data about individual users. It's not clear for what purpose the data points are used. It's not clear how long data is retained, etc., etc. So in terms of gaining back control, Google is offering a set of APIs, application programming interfaces, that will replace the cookie, but also will replace the uniqueness of the unique identifier, which is at the center of the cookie that's being shared at the moment between all these thousands of different advertising technology specialized companies. And they are offering two flavors. One is a little bit more privacy friendly than the other, but it relates to the different advertising business models that are out there. Obviously, there's not just one model. There's one technology at the moment is real-time bidding. And obviously, if you want to introduce a big change, because moving away from the unique cookie is quite a big change. So the first model is based on a categorization of the websites that you visit, and they call them topics. And the user controls see to a list of, like, before the browser would keep track of the very specific web pages that you visited. Now only a reduced set of information will be retained, which will be the topics. And this will be stored in the browser itself. It will not be passed on the server. It will not be retained on the server. So the privacy improvement, the second privacy improvement here is localization, keeping data local. And well, the whole idea of an API or locking data behind an application programming interface is that you need to request a data through that door, that window, so to say. And in terms of like the European view on principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, for example, this is a way how to embed or operationalize these legal principles that hover over the privacy and e-privacy and cookie rules to embed it into the technology in the browser. So the API warrants purpose limitation, it warrants data minimization, for example. So this is the so-called topics API. And then there's another API at the moment, it's called protected audience API, which is much more geared to the traditional retargeting model, which is close to the electric toothbrush that you bought. And then it will be, you will see ads or value propositions for that toothbrush for the weeks to come. But also in the case of the protected audience API, privacy improvements have been made. It's also based on APIs, but obviously the whole real-time bidding ecosystem needs to connect to these APIs as well. So the real-time bidding model that we see today will most likely interact most of the cases with the protected audiences API. And this is basically a new territory. Advertising companies are asked to test and to see whether the core privacy improvement that Google is offering, which is adding noise. Basically, they're reducing the accuracy of information about individual website visitors to a level that's more acceptable. And obviously, Google sets these levels. But that noise level, in terms of being able to measure whether a brand spending money, whether that every dollar was spent well, has to be relatively accurate. So it's important to understand how much noise was added, such that they can extrapolate or recalibrate at the end their campaigns and their reports to understand, okay, but how effective is advertising through this channel actually? So in terms of privacy improvements, the noise to levels that are added within that complexity is something to keep an eye on. But obviously, I'm an engineer from my background, so I look at things from the data layer up. I'm very interested in how browsers work and how browsers evolve, what defaults are, and specifically what functionality is actually offered through the APIs. And so this is why I'm interested to see how the Google ecosystem develops.
Well, I think we all are really. But I think it's actually hard for the average person, you know, if you're going across the web, to really understand what is going on behind the scenes. And most people don't really want to think about it. What they want to, you know, they want to read the news story they came to see, or they want to buy the thing they wanted to buy, or they want to chat with the friend they came to chat with. You know, they don't really want to spend their time worrying about how they're being bought and sold. Which is, I guess, what one of the things the Future of Privacy Forum does, isn't it? Is think about what's going to happen to ordinary people as a result of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do is to really look at, okay, this is coming up in the near future. How is this going to affect real people? But what are the core issues here? And are the controls that are being offered, are they effective? Are they good enough? Are there maybe areas that are overlooked? Or are there areas that can be misused by bad actors? I mean, there's a lot of fraud in the advertising ecosystem. There's the advertising data flows can be used for different surveillance tasks than the whole advertising ecosystem has been designed for. I mean, there are many problems out there which we can touch on, but it's clear that if the ecosystem is built on retaining a rich profile of individual users, and obviously that information can be reused by others outside of the advertising ecosystem as well. So there's a lot at stake here, and you need specialists like myself to worry about this, and also to engage not just with the technology companies, but also with the regulators and the data protection authorities to think through the issues and the controls, and to have discussions on the fundamental rights and the protections that are there in the different markets. And since, for instance, the real-time bidding technology is being redesigned at the moment, that will not be limited to just one market. This will be rolled out on a global scale. So it's also important to look at the differences in protection in terms of privacy, or the non-existence of it in countries across the world. So yeah, this is why there's an interest for Future of Privacy Forum to follow this, and me and my colleague Aaron Massey and Stacey Gray are following this very closely. Also, Jules Polonetsky has spent many years within the advertising industry. So yeah, I think we're positioned very well to understand how the technology works, but also to bridge this to policy questions. And obviously these questions are different in different parts of the world.
Do you get the sense that the companies take advantage of the more lax laws in the US to be more exploitive, or do they actually have, or do they build one system that conforms as much as they can to the most restrictive regime, which I guess would be Europe and the GDPR.
Well, obviously, if you look at like the bottom line of where do you actually make money, from a policy perspective, this is about collection limitation versus use limitation. The ad blocker, which we briefly touched on, and the consent banner, they are designed to limit collection of data. And if the data is not there, you cannot share it, you cannot reuse it or repurpose it for other purposes. And in most of the world, specifically outside of Europe, the default is that you have use limitation. So data is already being collected, but it's outside of the protection and the technology of your browser and your computer. It's somewhere on a server, it's being shared with other parties. And so that's much more difficult to protect, and basically to protect the individuals and the rights for the individuals. So this cultural difference in design of the defaults basically is reflected on how this plays out in different parts of the world. Yeah. And in Europe, there's a big pushback. Actually, there were 10 members of European Parliament calling for a moratorium on targeted advertising. It's a sound that's slowly and more prominently being amplified over the last few years. We've seen this play out.
It certainly seems like there have been a lot more fines and findings against the companies lately.
Yes, but the question is how effective the fines are. There's a lot of money to be made if you look at the amount of money that's actually being traded in the ecosystem at the moment. The interesting thing is, what's the effect of a fine in terms of fundamentally changing the ad tech ecosystem? And I've been in this space since 2010, and I've not seen a lot of change, to be honest. And therefore, it's easy to zoom in on the limitations of Google's proposal and the fact that it's limited to Google's own browser and not adopted yet by other browser vendors. But still, it's an improvement from where we are today. And then I think it's good to think through, okay, maybe it's baby steps that we're moving towards a different type of advertising ecosystem than we are today. But it's clear for everyone that we have today is totally disproportionate and can be abused by state actors for very different purposes than it was originally designed for. So everybody agrees we need to move away to something else. And so the technology matters, but what also matters is that the policies need to evolve as well to make sure that that new ecosystem fits with the restrictions that are culturally connected to the opt-in or the opt-out markets that we live in.
Rob, you mentioned Google's changes in data collection, but they're also involved heavily in artificial intelligence, and that's been the big buzzwords in the United States, at least, and I'm sure around the world. How do you see this impacting advertising, digital advertising, going forward? Have you seen a lot of usage of these various AI platforms yet, or is that something that's perhaps just being researched?
Well, machine learning has been part of online advertising for many years already, but the breakthrough piece of technology that we've seen the last year is a generative AI. And generative AI is not just limited to applications based on language. It's also possible for basically you will reduce the amount of time, but also will enhance the quality of the like visual ads that needed a lot of people and a lot of time to design before. So imagine that before crafting an animated digital advertisement consisted of many layers, many static images that it had to be animated with specifically designed programming code. Additional code had to be added to be able to measure frequency and reach, and you had the cookie, all these complexities. A lot of that was done by manual labor, but also using libraries and frameworks. Now, a marketing specialist can basically start describing, and whether that's what happens now is by just describing, I want an ad of a beer bottle, and a beer bottle needs to be standing in front of a nice and pleasing background, for instance, on an island. And I want to make sure that that beer bottle has the illusion of coming towards me, and that I would like to grab it and buy it and drink it. By describing it in this way, generative AI will take that, instead of programming code, they will create that ad that you were looking for. So that ad can now be injected in the ecosystem and can be placed and sold on the advertising space that's out there. So the first application that we see here is a simplification in the design of ads, but also to make ads more pleasing and interactive. So this is where at the moment generative AI plays a big role. Another part where generative AI works well is in a technology called A/B testing. And A/B testing is a statistical approach where you can see how do people respond to a button, which is somewhere on my website. And what if I change that button in shape? Maybe I change its color. Maybe I want to change the font to make it more pleasing. With A/B testing, you have a nice statistical method in trying to see what works best for your different groups of users that are using your website. And obviously, the intricacies or the behavioral patterns that you can measure statistically are well fit for generative AI technology to detect these patterns and advise and optimize website content specifically for the audience. I'm taking this one step further because we are now talking about text, we're talking about images, but also we can go to video. So it will be any to any, whether it's a text or video or spoken word to any. And so this is where the advertising technology is slowly embracing generative AI as well, because in the end, we're talking about a communication channel. A brand wants to communicate with potential buyers or already existing clients and have a conversation about products, about purchases, about how people experience products. And this comes in many forms and shapes. The digital advertisement is one of them. And certainly and not just in the generative element aspect to it, where you create an ad, but also in how you measure it and etc. It will play a big role, and this is currently being implemented and tested. Absolutely.
I remember doing a book review for, I think it was Ars Technica, where the editor casually mentioned that they did A/B testing on the headlines, which I thought was amazing, I mean, it must seem to people who do that sort of thing, it must seem so incredibly kamikaze the way we used to live, where you would think up the headline, it would go in the magazine, it would be printed, and you wouldn't find out for a month what people thought of it. When we spoke in Brussels, Rob, you were very keen on a new project of yours on hyper nudging. Is this a good moment to talk about it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a word we invented during our conversation.
Oh, really? I thought you already had it hatched in your mind. So does that mean I get a finder's fee?
We can adopt it together if people start adopting the term. But frankly, what it sees to is the fact that a generative AI is a technology capable of detecting subtle behavioral patterns that are easily overlooked by humans, and not just patterns by one individual, but at scale of large groups. And for instance, if we look at the way we've been nudged over the years, nudging, and we just briefly touched on A/B testing, is an important flavor in terms of advertising. You want to make your value proposition as interesting as possible, whether it's in color, whether it's in shape, whether it's in the way the sounds are added in the background. The fact that you interact with digital content makes it that your behavior will be recorded, but also in real time analyzed. And obviously, we're all individuals. We have many aspects in common, of course, but there are aspects that generative AI will be able to pick up, and then ads and value propositions can be changed according to that. So this is what I mean with hyper nudging. The statistical approach of A/B testing works really well with being able to fine tune that communication that you have through a digital advertisements and your web browsing behavior, to fine tune that to who we are. And that's basically an area that I keep a close look on, a close look at, because it's very close to my own academic research. But hyper nudging, yeah, I think that's the next thing that we should be aware of. Absolutely.
I think it sounds something like what Jeff Chester at Center for Democracy and Technology used to talk about. I recall probably about 10 years ago now, a friend of mine convened a workshop in Edinburgh to talk about these things, and Jeff was already all over political manipulation and, you know, sort of targeted political campaigning and stuff even then. And I remember writing something about it at the time, the sense of, is this the last chance we have to avert this?
Yeah, Jeff focused on many aspects, like the influence of digital advertising to children, specifically when you're advertising products with a lot of sugar or salt or things that are not good for children, and the COPPA legislation in the background. He was always a big proponent to show the risks and the effects of advertising, and basically the absence or of policy in the US specifically. And the EU, and we see this now with, for instance, with TikTok, that and the new laws like Digital Service Act, where showing behavioral ads to minors has become an issue. So in terms of verifying before you actually start that online advertising communication with your visitor to understand whether you're dealing with a child or with a minor has become very important. We see this with TikTok, but we'll see this with other online services as well. So age gating and verifiable parental consent are things that are actually part of the data flow designs at the moment, because of the policy choices that regulators and legislators take in protecting the more vulnerable in our society. And children are one example of that.
Yeah, the UK is very keen on age verification, and they've been pushing it for some years. I think the French Data Protection Authority, CNIL, how do you pronounce it?
Yeah, yes, the CNIL, yes.
Yeah, haven't they said that they were opposed to adopting age verification because none of the technologies were sufficiently privacy preserving? Didn't they say something like that?
I do not recall this specifically, but obviously machine learning, and which has the risk of false positives or false negatives, will not be good enough to reach that policy goal of protecting all minors or all vulnerable groups. So this is a little bit of a catch-22, and identity becomes more and more important. And this is where, if you're actually, we're actually moving away from the open web here a little bit as well. Most of us will interact with platforms. What I see is a shift towards very strong identification first before you can actually enter a platform. And once identity has been established, and age will be an important element of the identity of the individual, and then you will be subjected to an advertising experience based on whether that you need more protection or not. So identity, well, most of us come from an anonymous internet, which is something from like 20 years ago. We're now moving towards a platform-based economy where you start with strong identity. There will not be anonymity anymore, but there will be a more proportionate type of engagement with you based on your fundamental rights, etc., etc. So there's a very different type of internet that we are moving towards. And that's a shift in comparison to 20 years ago. Sorry.
But are we actually moving towards it at this point? Because, you know, Twitter has never been financially successful, and it's now becoming socially unsuccessful. Meta is spending an awful lot of money on something that seems unlikely to come to fruition. And you know, I think this may be skewed by the places that I frequent, but there is a big push away from the sort of centralized platform-based economy you're describing, and towards a much more decentralized web that is much more like the web of the 90s than it is like the web of the 2010s. And, you know, Mastodon being the prime example of a federated service where people have a much greater degree of control than they did in a centralized platform.
Yeah, the independent web, indie web.
Mm-hmm. But to an extent, I agree with you. But if we look at what young people are actually adopting, what young people use in order to communicate, to experiment, to grow up, to become an adult, I think that's like the important social aspect to keep an eye on. And what I've seen so far is that they expect things to work. The choice between centralized and decentralized is not at the top of the list. User friendliness and a good user experience is important.
And being able to hide from their parents and going where their friends are.
The right to have or adopt different identities, that's an important one. You may have 10 different accounts with 10 different identities where you communicate with different groups. So yeah, I think a lot has to do in the liberty to participate in society. But traditionally, the web was a different place. It was not a platform. It was a collection of different places you could go and visit.
And it was a lot, I have to say, it was a lot more fun then. You know, there's something, I mean, the last 5 or 10 years, I got a lot out of Twitter, and I was very sad to see. I was very sad when Musk bought it, because I knew it was going to die. And I'm getting a certain amount of fun and education out of Mastodon. But you know, there's something about, you get up every day and you go to the same 4 or 5 websites. I mean, I miss, you know, sort of this slightly anarchic, you know, thing of things popping up, new things popping up every day. And you can sort of replicate that if you read the front page of Reddit and the front page of Metafilter and the front page of a few other things. But it's still, you know, it's still shrunk. It's still somehow shrunken compared to what we had at the beginning.
I don't know how you experience the Mastodon, but I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, for example, less on Twitter, and also less on Mastodon. But I actually enjoy a little bit of recommendation, to be honest, to separate noise from what may be interesting for me. And there are different ways to design that. And obviously, there are different patterns based on behavioral advertising that are not in my interest that you could put on top of that. But in essence, spending so much time to filter out myself what could be relevant, what not. I value the time when I'm concentrated, and any generative AI or algorithm or recommendation aspect, where I have the control to maybe switch it on or switch it off, or maybe change the intensity to which content is recommended to me. That's the type of experience that I like. And it should not be a binary choice with ads or no recommendation at all. That's too much of a, that should be a scale. And I don't see that happening yet, but that's where I would aspire to. And the whole decentralized Mastodon idea without any recommendation, to me, is too much of an investment in terms of the time that it can be concentrated throughout the day.
That's interesting because I always turn off everything I can. On Twitter, my feed was always chronological, and I don't really read much Facebook because I can't control things very well on Facebook. But I mean, the way I have solved that is by curating who I follow. I don't expect the site to do that for me. I expect to do that for myself. And I have to say, during the acute phase of the COVID pandemic, being able to directly follow, sort of medical experts who could interpret the research papers that were coming out was just awesome. And what is interesting about this is that you and I want very different things from our social media. I want nothing to interfere with reality.
I want time to be optimized. I want to hear things before they come in the news, and I want to be alerted of very specific reports that come out. And maybe some of my peers have spotted it, so they will share it. But if you do not post much and you don't know how the algorithms work, it may not surface. So that spread of relevant information, the ability to be able to pick up relevant information, like out of curiosity or personal interest or for work, that's a difficult problem to solve. But I do still rely a lot on newsletters, to be honest. And so a lot of the information I get still I receive through email.
I don't know if it's like this. I don't know if it's like this for John, but particularly for TV shows, I get almost all my recommendations from people on the well, because there's a TV conference, and whose tastes are like yours, and you just follow that. I don't know, John, do you do that with books?
I'm more proactive. I mean, I tend to learn of something and go and find it, and I don't have like a particular source or recommendations. But I think the point we're making here is that everybody is pretty different in the way that they interact with media and the way that they use the web. And I don't know, kind of going back to what we were saying about needing to be able to verify the age of a child, that set me thinking whether we're talking about like issuing an ID to every user of the internet and storing data about age and other things that a browser can read so that it will know whether it can serve you something or not. And it seems to me that while that does give us more control, that we also lose something. We lose quite a bit if we have that kind of restriction.
May I suggest you not move to Utah?
Don't worry.
No, it's just that Utah has passed, and I think it's Utah that passed a law requiring social media sites to age verify kids or people, which means
that may be the Texas has passed some laws too.
Verify everybody.
Well, I'm encouraged by all the efforts both in the EU and in this country to protect our data and our privacy. But the digital elephant in the room is there are a lot of bad actors out there. The so-called dark web has marketplaces where you can buy people's privacy and their data. And do you have any hope that this can be fixed somehow? I can't imagine how. But Rob, what do you think about the bad actors in the advertising space?
To me, there are like multiple types of bad actors. The ones that abuse the advertising ecosystem. That's like the ad fraud. That is not really affecting people like us. It's more affecting the brands that are paying for it. So that's like but it's a really big problem to solve in the advertising ecosystem, ad fraud. And it leads to the demand of being able to then differentiate whether an ad is shown to a real human or to a bot. And there are many technical proposals to try to verify whether you have so this is beyond detecting whether you are dealing with a child, but let's simplify it to actually dealing with a real human. And one of these proposals is called trusted tokens. And the interesting idea here is that you do not need a lot of data or information. You just basically you need a binary answer. Is this a human? Yes or no? So the whole privacy opportunity here is to design, and this is data minimization, to just provide for that answer. And this is what's actually happening. This is standardized. This is being adopted. And not just by Google in the Chrome web browser, but also in other web browsers, where the trusted token becomes a means to answer that question. Am I dealing with a human or not? So in terms of bad actors and to combat advertising fraud, that's an area that's being explored now. The other one, which is about data breaches, where people steal profiles. I'm actually a little bit more positive now, because before we had huge troves of data about individuals, but that's going to move away because most of the advertising technology will not be designed around the third-party cookie anymore. So for instance, in the Google proposal, it's all decentralized and minimized and noise is added. So the value of that type of information on the dark web will decrease, because it will not be about you anymore. It will be about a group of people. That's one beginning of an answer to your observation.
You know, I think we're at a point now where we just have a couple of minutes left. Do we have any last words, Rob or Wendy?
I think Rob should have the last word.
If the last words are for me, I really hope that the efforts that many of the activists are putting up today, whether they are fighting for rights for anonymity, or whether they're fighting for a moratorium on behavioral advertising, I think I hope that all see that the baby steps that we're taking in changing the whole ecosystem will be for the better, because we will not revert back to a world where there will not be any online advertising. Advertising is part of the way our society is built, and the challenge is to do that in a balanced and proportionate way, such that we can all benefit from what's out there. And that's my hope, and I try to contribute to that as much as I can.
That reminds me that I
Thank you.
remember.
Nope. Go ahead.
That does remind me that in 1994, I was reading a Usenet news group, and I remember a posting that said, "This is the end of the web." An he'd seen his first advertisement, I think, on Yahoo.
Yeah, and I remember when Cantor and Siegel sent that first spam email. Oh my God!
That was Usenet. That was Usenet. They sent out this posting advertising a green card on Usenet. It was in all these newsgroups. Everybody went bananas.
End of the world. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for joining us. We can see that there's a lot of complexity that you're dealing with and that we're all going to be dealing with. And let's all hope for a better future.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'd love to have you back sometime. I'm sure the things will continue to change, and we'd like an update.
And there's always a lot to talk about. Okay, well, thanks, and thanks, Wendy, and thanks, Scoop.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.